This podcast is brought to you by Radio 786.
We're going to be focusing on this very interesting figure in the form of Captain Ibrahim Traore of Burkina Faso. Burkina Faso is the name given by Thomas Sankara, well, at least his generation of leaders, which translates into the land of the upright. And that part of the world has been anything entirely but upright, because there's been so many vested interests, and one could trace this back to, it's an allegation, but it's a very strong allegation that has found some sort of resonance, and that is that Blaise Compaoré, that name may sound familiar, was the former leader of Burkina Faso, which, just for geographical perspective, it's sort of West Africa. So if you look at the map of Africa, it's in front of you. You look towards the northern part, the upward part of the continent, and to your left you go. So that's West Africa, and that is where Burkina Faso is situated. So let's come back to Thomas Sankara. He comes in anti-imperialist, set the country on a path that frees it from Western colonial influence, particularly the French. He is then later assassinated and overthrown by the enabling of Blaise Compaoré, who then holds on to those colonial ties. Compaoré is later then also deposed, and you have successive governments that have come in, all through coup d'etats. Many of those coup d'etats have been accepted by largely Western powers because it kept in line, their gratification, very unjustly so, with mining and others, installations that had been in that country. There's been, of course, a big French military presence as well in Burkina Faso, which had largely been there to protect those mining interests. And so here you have, what's his name, Mr. Dembe, the former military leader of Burkina Faso, who then also through a coup d'etat is in power and promises a whole lot of things, who's then later overthrown by one of his own soldiers that's under his command, and that is and happens to be Captain Ibrahim Traore, when he marched onto the capital to overthrow the former military leader. And so admirers compare him to the revolutionary that is Thomas Sankara, calling him a modern-day symbol of African self-determination. His message seems to be resonating beyond West Africa, because it's not just Burkina Faso, it's Burkina Faso, Mali, that sort of entire region there that has been in the swing of coup d'etats. And so as it stands right now, we are going to be talking about Captain Ibrahim Traore, and why, for instance, recently Russia had rolled out the red carpet for him, why he seems to be in the crosshairs of the French in particular, and we do so with Dr. Pedro Mzileni, a senior lecturer in the Department of Sociology at the University of Zululand. Good morning and welcome.
Well, firstly, thank you for having me on your show. And I want to commend your registration up front, if you may allow me, please, for hosting a conversation about Ibrahim Traore of Burkina Faso and about the latest developments in the Sahel region of West North Africa on a Tuesday morning at 8 a.m. So this is an important moment.
It most certainly is, yeah.
This is an important moment in modern international history, which I will explain why. And I think you are taking your listeners very seriously, which is honestly a beautiful practice to observe in the current climate of public narratives that are rooted in ignorance. So,
okay. Lovely stuff. Thank you very much, certainly, for that. Let's talk about, the fact that the coup d'etats are understood to be, this unconstitutional usurping of power, which, to be honest, the West hasn't, it often pronounces as, not being able to accept that sort of scenario, but it did so, in Egypt, for instance, where you have a military leader there, which is Sisi, that is now the head of the country, the president of the country, that effectively deposed Mohamed Morsi, for instance, and because that was in alignment with American interests, his candidacy to become president had largely been accepted. And so when in fact, just about a week or two ago, I listened to an American official speaking to the I think it was one of the Senate hearings in which he had claimed that Ibrahim Traore needs to be gotten rid of, that he's using the resources of the country to fund his projects and so on and so forth, and that sort of thing. We saw on the one end clearly where the West stands on the leadership of Ibrahim Traore, and for instance where Russia stands on this, where Russia has of course rolled out the red carpet for him, has had one-on-one conversations with Vladimir Putin, and this has been in the field of not just military, it's been in the field of education and science and that sort of thing. And there seems to be now not just the contestation of narratives, but also the contestation of where power lies and wherein it is concentrated. And so in the form of Ibrahim Traore, that's this 37-year-old, in the broader politics still seen as pretty much a young man. Why is there such dynamism that we see on display at the moment that I suppose speaks to what could be the reshaping of Western Africa?
Yeah, you're spot on. Firstly, America, it does not necessarily have a problem with the military states. It only has a problem when it's a military state that is completely against the neoliberal project of American empire. Just to zoom in closely to Burkina Faso itself, actually. Immediately after Sankara was assassinated in 1987, Blaise Compaoré came into power. And he remained over the affairs of Burkina Faso as a leader on an authoritarian state for over 27 years. And America didn't have a problem with him because primarily he invited the IMF back into the affairs of Burkina Faso, and essentially he reversed all the nationalization policies of Sankara. So America does not mind having a dictator for so long as that dictator is going to advance the imperial policies of Western American empire. The reason why American empire, on the other hand, had a problem with Sankara, it is because he was working on dethroning the West as a unipolar power of the world. I mean, for an example, Sankara spoke in the 39th UN General Assembly in 1984, where he essentially theorized the triple solidarity movement of the three continents in the world, which is Asia, Latin America, and Africa, whose people must rise up against exploitation of the North and self-determine on a simple language rooted in people's struggles. Now, that language, which seeks to essentially make Africa self-reliant, united, and rooted in the Pan-African philosophy of prioritizing its own people, then American empire will have a problem with such a leader, whether that leader is elected or not. But let me make one more point. The leadership of Ibrahim Traore since 2022, October, is not a coup d'etat. It's not a junta movement. It's rather a people's movement, right? It's a people's movement to seize political power, because one of the things that stands out about Burkina Faso in international history is that Burkina Faso is also an epistemic leader of ideas around the organization of nations and communities. So democracy as a concept, it does not mean that we must take a single tunnel definition only from a single society of the American state as its definition of democracy, but rather democracy must live up to its name, which is there must be a diversity of thought and there must be a respect for the different ways that each civilization and each society chooses to organize its own people. And Burkina Faso has always done that. Burkina Faso always has its own systems, its own definitions that are rooted in its own context. And one of them is that the leadership of Ibrahim Traore has studied carefully that the so-called democratic elections in the Sahel region have been vulnerable to Western market infiltration, where puppets are funded to run for office in order for the population to elect people who are under the control of the French and the American Empire. So what they're now doing through Ibrahim Traore now is redefining that system and trying to come up with a system now that will be in total control of the people of Burkina Faso without Western infiltration. And we must give them time to come up with a government of the people, but this seizure of power by the population, the popular mass population of Burkina Faso is the beginning of that chapter.
And what's interesting is that, when you try and do some research on Burkina Faso as it stands right now, and one of the suggested questions about whether Burkina Faso is a rich or a poor country, Google will tell you that it is generally considered a poor country, classified as a low-income country with limited natural resources. I'm not certain I buy that, because why then, to begin with, is there such a sharp focus by Western leaders, particularly the French, in Burkina Faso? They do share quite a strong interest in what's going on in that country, to so much so to the point that it would appear that Emmanuel Macron, the French leader, is seeking to court a very favorite viewpoint or very favorite impression of Ibrahim Traore, at the moment, that he wants to give some sort of French presence in Western Africa. And so I want to just try and understand this claim here of it being a poor country with limited natural resources seems to suggest that there's not much going on there to fight about.
Well, that claim by Google is incorrect. Google, of course, we know, it's a private company from America. So we're not surprised about how it frames Burkina Faso. But to rescue the listenership from ignorance, again, we have to highlight international history on this aspect. Firstly, Burkina Faso was a French colony, which was named Upper Volta. It gained independence in 1963, 1964 from French colonial rule, and it was only named Burkina Faso in 1984 when Thomas Sankara became the prime minister and president. Now, when Western colonial powers occupy a region, they do it primarily for 4 reasons. One, they want to maintain a world system of a neoliberal white supremacy structure. 2, for purposes of resource extraction and also the extraction of cheap labor. In other words, they have to dehumanize the population so that it can be available as cheap labor and also extract the cheap resources in the area. But the last one, which is most important, is also the killing of alternative imaginations. So in other words, they go in to displace the education, cultural systems that were in place and replace them with their own. Now, as you all know, that the Sahel region, which consists of nation states like Niger, Burkina Faso, Chad, Cote d'Ivoire, Ghana, you name them, it's popular for a resource called uranium, which is crucial in the development of nuclear weapons and also the generation of electricity. Now, American Empire and also French Empire, they all have military bases in that region. For instance, the United States has a military base in Niger, especially Air Base 101 in Niamey, the capital of Niger. And the US also has another one in Agadez called the Air Base 201. The military bases that are situated in that region, essentially, they are there to look after the commercial interests of empire. So that whenever there's a revolt by the population, or there is any possibility of a leader emerging with a program to dethrone Western interests for the advancement of the people's interests in Africa, those military bases get used as launch pads to cause instability in the region. And we all know that once colonial powers cause military instability in the region, these instabilities, because also they take place in regions where the sources of livelihood are cut off from people. In other words, there's high rates of poverty and unemployment. The conflicts tend to be ethnicized. They tend to take on religious divisions as well. In other words, they turn the population against itself, and they have a media power across the globe that is able to sponsor propaganda in the population so that it turns against its own revolutionary leaders. We saw this when it was done in Zimbabwe under the leadership of Robert Mugabe when he advanced the land restoration program. All kinds of media resources were deployed to sponsor regime change in Zimbabwe, but most importantly, the sanctions on Zimbabwe created a livelihood crisis which made the population turn against its own leader. So there's a strong disinformation media campaign driven by sources like Google, Microsoft, BBC, CNN, and all Western media powerhouses to advance this notion that Burkina Faso is a poverty-stricken country under a crisis, and it is being led by a violent leader who is there to violate human rights. We've heard all these things before because we've now lived long enough to understand how Western empire works when it wants to infiltrate Africa and interrupt its cause for liberation.
Yeah, and talking about the media, let's look at what has been the most recent reporting on Burkina Faso, and that is by the BBC, just in the last couple of hours, saying that, and citing a Human Rights Watch report. Now, again, this Human Rights Watch organization was also seen to often issue very questionable reports, during the supposed Syrian uprising, which was later found to be nothing more than just a geopolitical issue that saw Turkey, together with particularly Israel and the United States, collaborating there to make the claim, of course, that Bashar al-Assad had been, this evil leader that needed to be overthrown. And that's when we saw quite a number of Human Rights Watch and other NGOs, etc., finding their voice on, perceived abuses and so on. But I don't want to... Let me just put it to you that, there's this claim that there's this ongoing fighting in Burkina Faso, the latest of which is that 130 people, civilians, had been killed by the Central Burkina Faso government forces. It's been described as a massacre and targeting the Fulani people, which are largely a Muslim community, or the government said they're backing, the claim of these military insurgency, the Al-Qaeda type, which, by the way, Muslims in the majority do not accept as a representation. And so something like 40% of Burkina Faso, we are told through reports, are under control of groups linked to Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State operating in West Africa's Sahel region. So how do we understand what is the presence of a genuine military insurgency that, certainly is not the expression of any sane, rational thinking Muslim community. That just to be very clear about that. The Muslim community, the majority, do not accept Al-Qaeda, ISIS, and so on. But there is an insurgency. We saw a bit of this as well in parts of Mozambique and elsewhere that is taking hold of the continent. And while at the same time the government seeking to establish control and order, which, by the way, they cite that insurgency as one of the key issues for why the country is not moving forward. And so I want to understand this claim around, it being in the interest of Western media and their agencies to be able to paint Ibrahim Traore and his government in a certain light vis-a-vis the very genuine concern that comes with this military insurgency.
Well, we know that when colonial powers seek control of an African state, they use two methods, direct rule and also indirect rule. If now I were to invoke the works of Mahmoud Mamdani, NGOs and the so-called international human rights organizations, they are part of the indirect rule mechanism of colonial power. Issa Shivji, in his book titled The Silences in the NGO Discourse, The Role and Future of NGOs in Africa, says, Western-funded NGOs are undemocratic, not elected by the people, and frankly, they are the foot soldiers of imperialism in Africa. So another method of indirect rule is also the planting of leaders with black faces in institutions of Africa, but in their souls who represent white European Western interests. One of them, for an example, is ECOWAS, the Economic Community of West African States, which essentially is enabling the exploitation of resources and cheap labor in the Sahel region by the French government and American empire. So all these forces I've indicated, including Western media, they have a common program, which is to mislead and confuse the population, to also kill the imagination of the population to reinvent an alternative political system to organize their own communities themselves. We know that American Western Empire wants neoliberal elections in the Sahel region because they know that such a system is vulnerable to being infiltrated by market interests, where they'll be able to buy their own candidates, fund their political campaigns, give them policy directions that favor the North, and indirectly install themselves through the so-called mandate of the population. Now, like I said at the beginning, Ibrahim Traore has studied this method very, very carefully. In fact, Ibrahim Traore is presented in Western media as this violent military leader. Yet, Ibrahim Traore is very good with negotiations. He is able to engage on diplomatic global platforms. We saw in the Africa-Russia summit in 2023, where he sat alongside global leaders to engage in a very civil conversation about the future of the world and the future of Africa in the global economy. So we're talking here about a very well-thought leader of the people of Burkina Faso, but of course we know the media of Western interests wants to present to us a propaganda of a person who appears to be violent, so that as a population we can agree with the West in overthrowing him. So we have to be careful. We have to learn from our own history, especially as South Africa, because In the 1990s, we all know that the National Party, as it was heading towards the end of its power, sponsored violent protests between different ethnicities and different political groups of black people. And there was a lot of violence in homelands in the 1990s. All this was done to present a propaganda to the world that says black people will be unable to govern themselves because all they do is kill each other. So we have seen these methods being tried before, even in our own land of South Africa. And therefore, we must be fully awake now when the same script is being played out in the Sahel region.
And so let's look at how Traore is trying to put together a state because of, the very topsy-turvy, governments that we've had in Burkina Faso over the last while. He came into power in 2022. He, of course, ditched the former colonial power that is France in favor of an alliance with Russia. He has included the deployment of a Russian paramilitary brigade, as well as adopting what Western media would call left-wing economic policies. This includes the setting up of a state-owned mining company, requiring firms to give a 15% stake in their local operations and to transfer skills to the Burkinabe people. It would appear that even though Traore is now being accused of one dictator cozying up to another dictator, referring here to Vladimir Putin, and again, I don't subscribe to those perspectives. I'm just purely citing their own terminology, this Western terminology. That in Burkina Faso, even the Russian mining interests, for instance, that were given licenses in late April, were required to abide the same rules: 15% stake of local ownership, and the skills to be transferred to locals, which Traore has described as a revolution, in its making, and that, I suppose, will set that country and Traore's leadership up for some immense challenges because, these Western powers are not just being touched on their studio when it comes to military influence, but that military influence is primarily based on what sort of mineral wealth they can extract from Burkina Faso. There's also this claim that the gold mines previously owned by the London-listed firms, that they have now also been nationalized. And so I'm curious to understand how you think Traore is going about building this new dispensation that not only is he kicking out the French, which he has done, but he's now also rearranging the way in which the people can benefit from the mineral wealth of the country.
You're spot on. Ibrahim Traore is a very dedicated student of Thomas Sankara, but also a very dedicated student of international history. For an example, Ibrahim Traore, through the policy interventions he has made of nationalization in the past 2 years, they demonstrate his clear understanding of the class struggle in Africa, especially during the period of political independence. Let me say this quickly in 2 ways. Firstly, Ibrahim Traore knows that the nationalization of strategic resources of a country does not always translate into the socialization of those resources. In other words, you can nationalize resources in a country, but you might end up creating a new class of political elites who are in the administration of the state, who will enjoy the benefits of nationalization without them cascading down to the population. That has been the crisis of the class struggle in independent Africa since the 1960s. Now, Ibrahim Traore is now telling us that nationalization does not necessarily mean socialization. He is now going for socialization of resources, which is what Sankara did. Sankara made sure that the public service is not designed in a manner that will create a privileged junior bourgeoisie at the expense of the population. Instead, he used the resources of Burkina Faso to roll out mass literacy campaigns, to roll out mass women empowerment, to roll out the expropriation of land from French industries towards the peasant farmers and the people. So Ibrahim Traore is learning perfectly well from this Sankara script, and he is going ahead to implement this strategy according to the modern conditions that he finds himself at the moment. And we must appreciate the work that he has done in giving us this kind of literature. You know, the mistake of neoliberal political literature is to think that when figures like Sankara are assassinated, their ideas and spirits will also ash out on the earth like physical bodies. We have now lived long enough to witness that the ideas and spirits of fallen heroes and heroines of Africa remain in the minds and the hearts of the living generations of young people. And therefore, Pan-African thought as a method of resistance and development is now therefore popular amongst the youth in Africa, because the enemy against which these ideas were formed against remains in place. We still live under a single world system of exploitation that places us as a third world or a third priority, and therefore figures like Ibrahim Traore emerge naturally out of those conditions to continue the unfinished business of liberation.
Yeah, and again, Traore seems to be such an interesting figure. He, of course, as I highlighted a bit earlier, the naturalization or the nationalization rather of some of the mining houses. There's an Australian firm that is terribly upset about also one of its exploration licenses having been withdrawn. Traore, of course, kicking out the French military presence. That was quite a key milestone there. And then, of course, he attends the 80th anniversary of the Soviet victory over Nazi Germany in World War II. That is when, of course, Traore had gone to Russia. You recall that he also went to Ghana recently, where he attended the inauguration there of the new president, having stolen the show, as it were, with lots of interest into him as a person. And so the IMF also says that it is concerned about the situation in Burkina Faso, which is probably the strongest indication that perhaps there's something worth looking into Traore and what he represents at the moment. The question, of course, and we're running out of time, and I'll maybe just fast track because there's a number of other issues that I wanted to highlight in terms of how he's shaking things up in not just Burkina Faso, but Mali and Niger as well. These three that are ruled by military juntas at the moment. How do we get over the line around the issue around legitimacy to the point where look, I mean, this Western idea of democracy has been not just diluted, but it has found to not have any sort of relevance sometimes to certain conflicts that we see on the continent. And so while there are areas that makes Traore's candidacy for leader in Burkina Faso seem terribly let's call it attractive at the moment. There's going to, of course, have to be some sort of a how do I describe this? A recognition of his leadership to the rest of the world, and secondly, how then do we test whether in the majority his leadership is being supported by Burkina Faso's electorate and the citizens of Burkina Faso, and gives him a mandate that's strong enough to be able to introduce these reforms that also seemingly will protect his own leadership to avoid any future coup d'etats?
Well, the legitimacy of a leadership is certified by its own people and by its own population. Xi Jinping in China, for an example, has been the prime minister since 2013, meaning as we are speaking today, he's been leading the People's Republic of China now for 12 years. And in the conference of the Chinese Communist Party last year, they removed term limits from the Chinese state. In other words, for them, stability is important for their development. And you can see today that in the past 40 years, China has been on an upward trajectory of development that is outstanding, that has been unprecedented in international history, mainly because the region of Asia has been peaceful and stable. In other words, there has been no wars in that region over this period. But most importantly, the leadership question in Asia has been stable, and the population fully supports the privileges and the prosperity it has received from the industrial policies advanced by the Chinese state. So here you are, a living case study right in our midst of modernity, China, which is using a different model of democracy that fits its own context. The people of China do participate in regular elections for their districts, for their local states, and also for the regional and the national state as well. But it is not about replacing David with John. It's about coming up with the best policy programs from the people's voice that will fit the conditions of China under a leadership elected by the Communist Party that is capable to meet those targets. And this is what China has achieved. It's now the biggest industrial economy in the world. These things would not have been possible if there was no political stability in China. So Africa, on the other hand, everyone has something to say about Africa, particularly the West. It wants to define how Africa must shape its destiny. And the primary reason for this is because the world system does not believe that Africans are human beings. It does not believe that Africans are human beings capable of coming up with their own methods of development. Therefore, we must be constantly under Western scrutiny about what should be our own path of development. I think leaders like Ibrahim Traore are important for us because they are a symbol of resistance. They are a symbol of rejecting imperial knowledge systems. They are a symbol of rejecting democratic formulas of American empire. And they are putting on the table our own self-determined concepts that will liberate Africans and shape our own communities in our own ways. So if people listening to this, wherever they are in the world, and they love humanity, they believe that Africans are human beings, then they must allow Africans to think for themselves about the type of a society they want to organize. And leaders like Ibrahim Traore in Burkina Faso and the rest of the figures in the Sahel region, they must be fully supported to come up with a theory of liberation that will take us to our destiny. I'm sorry to say this, but I will have to go shortly.
No, we're actually done. So thank you very much for coming on to the program this morning, talking about Captain Ibrahim Traore, the new leader in Burkina Faso, and having painted the background to how he came to be where he is. He has shown lots of potential, for a an African leader with a different energy. He's 37 years old, and he's captured the hearts and the imagination of people the world over. He's sitting in the annals of power at the moment, and certainly somebody that is poised, if he keeps the path that is on at the moment, for trying something completely different, something Thomas Sankara started, and something that he could very well end up, taking the baton and continuing on that trajectory. But his pathway is littered with great challenges from the French, from Western powers like the United States, which had recently, during one of the Senate hearings, had raised the alarm, what they describe as the alarm around Ibrahim Traore and why perhaps he needs to go. So these are very interesting times that we live in.
This podcast is brought to you by Radio 786.